Ama. Está andando pelo passeio do canal que divide a cidade. Algumas barcaças navegando lentamente nas primeiras horas da manhã. À esquerda está a passarela de inspiração náutica com tábuas estilo convés e torres tipo mastros. À direita está a curva do rio
tudo
que
certo,
volta
né?
para o leste depois da ponte
Boa.
4, em direção ao dono de Catedral St. Paul. Ela sente o sol começar a se erguer. No ar, ainda uma brisa antes de a cidade ficar entupida de calor.
Stephanie.
Uma vilanista toca alguma coisa devidamente inspiradora.
Stephanie, mas eu escuto ainda a leitura.
A peça
Agora
de Ana,
foi. Ah, não.
a última amazona do reino de Daoné, estreia no Teatro Nacional essa noite.
Oi, querida.
Ele pode sair, o André?
Stephanie se conectando. Aê! Agora sim.
Que eu tinha desligado o vídeo. Eu estava num simpósio de tradução outro dia com o áudio desligado. Desculpa, o vídeo desligado.
Acontece, viu? Tô ligada que acontece muito. Bem-vinda. Você é a primeira. Estamos todos aqui, mas entre Bernardine e você, a Stephanie se conectando. Tá vazando o som aqui.
Uma última tentativa.
Stephanie, se quiser se conectar já, o canal português. Aê!
Ah,
Agora
eu esqueci
sim.
que eu tinha desligado o vídeo. Eu estava num simpósio de tradução outro dia com o áudio
Bernardine
desligado.
entrar.
Desculpa.
Pode ficar, tá? Acontece, viu? Tô ligada em nenhum momento de... Bem-vinda. Você é a primeira. Estamos todos aqui, mas entre Bernardine e você...
Cultivo de alimentos suficiente.
O que está passando é o que está passando um pouco. A gente tem um retorno de som do que está passando no YouTube, que são as leituras. Que os artistas, quer dizer, pessoas ou figuras de Paraty estão lendo. Não sei se você chegou...
Acabei de ser marcada num post da leitura da mesa de hoje.
Ah, boa. Boa. Bom, acho que tá tudo certo. Aqui você tirou as suas notificações ou deixou o celular no silencioso?
Sim.
Show.
Eu repassei todas as precauções aqui, vocês
Sério?
não estão vendo, mas a minha mesa aqui, ó, eu trouxe uma cola do roteiro que eu mandei para o André. Eu tenho um diagrama com todos os personagens do romance.
A educação na aldeia.
Uau!
Começa desde a primeira
Caramba! Maravilhoso, porque você pode ter mais acessórios do que quando você está num palco, né?
Pois é, tudo que podia acontecer. Tem o livro aqui em cima da mesa, tá tudo certo.
Maravilhoso. A gente não vê nada, né?
A chuva vem cair.
Tá tudo assim lindo, maravilhoso.
Desde pequeno, um bom peixe assado com vinho de açaí. Aprende que na arte de pescar, só se pesca o que vai precisar. E a calma é importante para a flecha no peixe acertar. Aprende com os mais velhos, nossa memória viva, com os espíritos conversar e deles a permissão receber para na mata entrar.
Eu não tinha porra nenhuma pra fazer lá. Quer dizer, por que será que moro com a minha ex-namorada, sua nova namorada e a ex-namorada dela? Como é que alguém pode se sentir bem assim? Eu poderia estar escrevendo essa história de uma cela de cadeia. Engraçado, né? Ted e Alice, antes da minha partida, disseram: nada é tão ruim que não possa piorar ele. Eu não sabia mais o que fazer. Peguei um voo sim, eu fiz isso. Para Portland. E a Julie e a Cris me buscaram no aeroporto. Eu estava muito doidona no avião.
Encontrei ela ali, hoje de manhã, de barriga para cima. Revelou Dona Elodia, indicando um ponto na praia onde se juntava o lixo que o mar trazia ou desenterrava. Troncos, sacolas plásticas, garrafas. Envenenada? Acho que sim. O que fizeram com ela? Enterraram? Dona Elodia fez que sim com a cabeça e disse:
Desculpa, Stephanie, estamos aqui, tá? Só resolvendo algumas paradinhas aqui.
Tudo bem, Sandrinha, eu imaginei, assim, eu estava preocupada.
Ama está andando pelo passeio do canal que divide a cidade. Algumas barcaças navegando lentamente nas primeiras horas da manhã. À esquerda está a passarela de inspiração náutica com tábuas estilo convés e torres tipo mastros. À direita está a curva do rio que se volta para o leste depois da ponte Waterloo, em direção ao dono de Catedral St. Paul. Ela sente o sol começar a se erguer. No ar, ainda uma brisa antes de a cidade ficar entupida de calor e fumaça. Uma violonista toca alguma coisa devidamente inspiradora mais adiante no passeio. A peça de Ama, a última amazona do reino de Daomé, estreia no Teatro Nacional essa noite.
Chegou um ponto em que os habitantes de Marte não podiam mais negar o aquecimento do seu planeta ou a escala da destruição que estava por vir. Em uma última tentativa desesperada de preservar sua civilização, eles construíram vastos canais conectando os polos do planeta à grande extensão de terra arrasada que cobriu o resto da superfície. O degelo anual das camadas de gelo polares produziria a água necessária para o cultivo de alimentos suficiente para a sobrevivência de pelo menos mais uma geração.
Educação indígena. A educação na aldeia indígena começa desde a primeira idade. Não segue os padrões de sala de aula. É um aprender sem pressa na solidariedade. Aprende que a agitação da formiga e o canto do sapo indicam que a chuva vem aí. Aprende a apreciar desde pequeno um bom peixe assado com vinho de açaí. Aprende que na arte de pescar só se pesca o que vai precisar. E a calma é importante para a flecha no peixe acertar. Aprende com os mais velhos nossa memória viva, com os espíritos conversar e deles a permissão receber para na mata entrar.
Eu não tinha porra nenhuma pra fazer lá. Quer dizer, Por que será que moro com a minha ex-namorada, sua nova namorada e a ex-namorada dela? Como é que alguém pode se sentir bem assim? Eu poderia estar escrevendo essa história de uma cela de cadeia. Engraçado, né? Ted e Alice, antes da minha partida, disseram: nada é tão ruim que não possa piorar ele. Eu não sabia mais o que fazer. Peguei um voo sim, eu fiz isso. Pra Portland. E a Julie e a Chris me buscaram no aeroporto. Eu estava muito doidona no avião.
Encontrei ela ali, hoje de manhã, de barriga para cima. Revelou Dona Elodia, indicando um ponto na praia onde se juntava o lixo que o mar trazia ou desenterrava. Troncos, sacolas plásticas, garrafas. Envenenada? Acho que sim. O que fizeram com ela? Enterraram? Dona Elodia fez que sim com a cabeça e disse: meus netos. Lá em cima, no cemitério? Não, aqui mesmo na praia. Muitos cães do povoado morriam envenenados. Havia quem dissesse que eram mortos de propósito, mas Damares não podia acreditar que existissem pessoas capazes de fazer algo assim e achava que os cachorros comiam por engano as iscas com veneno deixadas para os ratos, ou comiam os ratos, que por estarem envenenados eram caçados com facilidade. Sinto muito, disse Damares.
O imenso moedor está triturando animais mortos recolhidos nas estradas. Tanto o barulho do motor quanto dos ossos sendo esmagados ricocheteiam nas paredes altas do galpão. A mistura de som e fedor enfurece os sentidos. Edgar Wilson deixa o carrinho no lugar delimitado por um retângulo pintado no chão e sobe os degraus de uma escadinha de alumínio que dá acesso à caçamba do moedor, de onde é possível ver o lado de dentro. Consegue ver o que é? Grita um funcionário afastando o protetor auditivo. Não estou vendo nada, grita de volta Edgar Wilson. Desde cedo tá assim, agarrando. Mas não estou vendo nada.
Sobre o autoritarismo brasileiro. Lilia Moritz Schwartz. Demorei aqui, Escravidão e racismo. No Brasil, o sistema escravocrata transformou-se num modelo tão enraizado que acabou se convertendo numa linguagem com graves consequências. Graçou por aqui, do século XVI ao XIX, uma escandalosa injustiça amparada pela artimanha da legalidade. Como não havia nada em nossa legislação que vetasse ou regulasse tal sistema, ele se espraiou por todo o país, entrando firme nos costumes da terra. Imperou no nosso território uma grande bastardia jurídica, a total falta de direitos de alguns ante a imensa concentração de poderes nas mãos de outros. Fim.
Se alguém for um espírito guardião, mandado pela primeira vez para habitar um hospedeiro que veio ao mundo em Umoniá, uma cidade na terra dos grandes pais, a primeira coisa a surpreender o espírito seria a imensidão da terra. Quando o espírito guardião desce, com o corpo reencarnado do novo hospedeiro em direção à terra, O que se revela ao olho é assombroso. Subitamente, como se alguma cortina primordial fosse aberta, estamos expostos a uma extensão de vegetação verde e luxuriante.
Quando retirei a faca da mala de roupas, embrulhada em um pedaço de tecido antigo e encardido, com nódoas escuras e um nó no meio, tinha pouco mais de 7 anos. Minha irmã, Belonísia, que estava comigo, era mais nova há 1 ano. Pouco antes daquele evento, estávamos no terreiro da casa antiga brincando com bonecas feitas de espiga de milho colhidas na semana anterior. Aproveitávamos as palhas que já amarelavam para vestir feito roupas nos sabugos. Falávamos que as bonecas eram as nossas filhas, filhas de Bibiana e Belonísia.
Um apartamento em Urano. Em termos biológicos, afirmar que são necessários um homem e uma mulher para levar a cabo um processo de reprodução sexual é tão ridículo quanto eram, em outros tempos, as afirmações de que a reprodução só aconteceria entre 2 corpos que partilhassem a mesma religião, o mesmo sangue, a mesma cor de pele ou o mesmo status social.
Da mesma maneira que, enquanto estamos presos, não cremos na vida livre, que não podemos esquecer. Uma vez soltos, esquecemos a coerência interna da vida na prisão, de cuja realidade, no entanto, não duvidamos. Hoje sei que saí, venho saindo da prisão como quem sai de um sonho. Ao passo que, enquanto preso, eu julgava que Santo Amaro, o solar da fossa e a TV Record é que tinham sido um sonho do qual não era possível sair.
Às vezes você fazia um pensamento e morava nele, afastava-se. Construiu uma casa assim, longínqua, dentro de mim. Era esse o seu modo de lidar com as coisas. Hoje, prefiro pensar que você partiu para regressar a mim e não queria apenas a sua ausência como legado. Eu queria um tipo de presença, ainda que dolorida e triste. E apesar de tudo, nesta casa, nesse apartamento, você será sempre o corpo que não vai parar de morrer. Será sempre o pai que se recusa a partir.
Quando o menino tinha 4 anos, ele perguntou ao pai, por que as pessoas precisavam dormir? O pai respondeu, para que Deus conseguisse desfuder tudo que eles fuderam. Quando o menino tinha 12, ele perguntou à mãe, por que o pai tinha ido embora de casa? A mãe disse, para poder fuder com tudo que passar pela frente. Quando o menino tinha 13, ele quis saber por que o pai tinha voltado para casa. A mãe respondeu: eu tenho 41, eu não tô afim de ficar procurando alguém para fuder. Aos 14, quando os palavrões pareciam jorrar da boca dos amigos feito água num cano furado, a palavra foda não exercia nenhum fascínio sobre o garoto. Nenhum pingo.
Firme, não suporto o chão de seus fundamentos. Tô de saco cheio de chamar tua imprudência de lei. Cada noite conto meus irmãos, e pela manhã, quando alguns não sobrevivem para serem contados, conto as covas que deixaram. Estendo a mão ao povo preto e toco apenas o ar, seu truque de mestre, América. Ora ele respira, ora não. Abra cadáver, macumba para turista, feitiço que alega não praticar. Dá logo uma pistola ao meu primo para fazer o trampo por vocês. Eu tentei, gente branca. Tentei, branquelos, mas passaram o funeral do meu mano fazendo planos para um cafezinho, falando alto demais ao lado de seus ossos.
Ama está andando pelo passeio do canal que divide a cidade. Algumas barcaças navegando lentamente nas primeiras horas da manhã. À esquerda está a passarela de inspiração náutica com tábuas estilo convés e torres tipo mastros. À direita está a curva do rio que se volta para o leste depois da ponte Waterloo, em direção ao dono de Catedral St. Paul. Ela sente o sol começar a se erguer. No ar, ainda uma brisa antes de a cidade ficar entupida de calor e fumaça. Uma violonista toca alguma coisa devidamente inspiradora mais adiante no passeio. A peça de Ama, a última amazona do reino de Daomé, estreia no Teatro Nacional essa noite.
Chegou um ponto em que os habitantes de Marte não podiam mais negar o aquecimento do seu planeta ou a escala da destruição que estava por vir. Em uma última tentativa desesperada de preservar sua civilização, eles construíram vastos canais conectando os polos do planeta à grande extensão de terra arrasada que cobriu o resto da superfície. O degelo anual das camadas de gelo polares produziria a água necessária para o cultivo de alimentos suficiente para a sobrevivência de pelo menos mais uma geração.
Ou, como meu pai dizia, eu sou barranqueiro. Tem dois tipos de mineiro. Tem o mineiro do ferro e o mineiro do barro, como dizia o Guimarães Rosa. Né? E eu nasci na beira do Rio São Francisco, de modo que eu sou barranqueiro. Por um período eu fui secretário de Turismo e Cultura.
I was the Secretary of Tourism and Culture, a friend of mine, and I held this position. I took some medicine. I never had this health problem. I was totally cured before. And I took a vaccine even. I won't ever get this disease, I don't think. I'm vaccinated. There's something great that Marcos Ribas did, which is very inspiring for us, both in the project, the urban project, and FLIP itself, which is work that's called Way of Doing. This is it was some work that we did when we came to Paraty. I came here in 1981 to study some handicraft work with the local craftspeople. We learned from the way that they produced their own. There were canoes, there were sailboats, and local mills for cassava flour. And we recorded all this and recorded it on video cassettes at the time. And we produced this book, which is an anthology of the local craftspeople telling how they made their own crafts. And that's the way that we learned the deeper side of the town, to meet people, to learn how they produce their crafts. It's a man who founded a puppet theater company in Paraty. My first contact with FLIP was through Liz Calder. Liz Calder was the person who conceived the idea of FLIP. And she asked what we thought of the idea. And I said that I thought it was a fantastic idea. And it had everything to do with our concept of the natural destination or fate for Paraty, cultural tourism, focusing on this calling. Get a good producer, I said, because we'd have a person called Friederman, who was the great grandnephew of Thomas Mann. It didn't work very well. He tried something similar to FLIP here, but he needed more inspiration and experience. But she put together a good team, competent people, and did fabulous work founding FLIP. This was in 2003. And the result, we all are familiar with FLIP, with all the participation by the local people and writers from all over the world. The Ministry of Tourism and the Casa Azul Association present the 18th FLIP, the Paraty International Literary Festival. The project has benefited from a federal tax incentive law, Vani, and official sponsorship from the Itaú Bank Company, with the support of the Paraty Municipal Government, the Pinheiro Neto attorneys, and you all. Organized by Casa Azul, the Special Secretariat for Culture under the Ministry of Tourism and under the Brazilian federal government.
Esta mesa é ao vivo.
This roundtable is live, and you can send in your questions throughout the broadcast through the chat box on YouTube. At the end of this meeting, some of these questions will be addressed to the guest speakers. We wish you all a wonderful FLIP. Good evening. The greatest beauty of words is their living quality. The word is never still. It always gains new connotations and meanings. This year, perhaps the most difficult year of our lives, words like wall, separation, and distance might have become the defining traits for FLIP. After all, the COVID-19 pandemic has created the impossibility of the festival occurring on its main stage, the town square in Paraty. Fortunately, the word is alive. It takes its own paths until suddenly it emerges in front of us and it can never again be avoided. That was how Flip faced up with the word crossing, travessia in Portuguese, as Caetano Veloso and Paul Preciado on a roundtable that will be broadcast on Saturday, December 5. Travessia, from the title of Paul's book, refers to passage, transition, but also to crossing, crossroads. This year, for Flip, the crossing has become to mean exactly this, to be in the middle of our journey. Not from indecision, but by our realization that at this moment, our greatest strength comes from the weakness of being between one point and another. This year, we're between our homes and Paraty, between the local and the weakness of the vulnerability of the global, between orality and the written word. For the poet Luz Ribeiro, who is sharing the last roundtable in this virtual Flip with Natalia Leal, a writer, a slammer, and resident of Paraty, on Sunday, December 6th, Slam, spoken poetry contest, is the Agra of now, the here and now. It's a new relationship between literature and the public space. Since slam almost always happens on town squares and streets, but also on bus stations where the slam will take place at Paraty, and where it will take place this Sunday. And Flip, in turn, wishes to be in this crossing between 2 points, art and territory. That is why at the end of this 18th Paraty International Literature Festival, we hope that you, more than meeting us on the other side, will remain in the transition with us between here and there, in the crossroads.
Que eu passo a palavra para Stephanie Borges, escritora.
In the crossing, now with great honor, I turn the floor over to writer and translator Stephanie Borges, who will lead this conversation with the British author Bernardine Evaristo. We wish you all a wonderful Flip.
Boa noite a todos, todas e todes. Sejam bem-vindos à mesa de abertura, a 18ª Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. Eu sou Stephanie Borges, sou poeta, tradutora, jornalista.
Poet, writer, a journalist, and today I'm here with you to talk with Bernardine Evaristo, the winner of the Man Booker Prize. Bernardine Evaristo is the author of fiction books, fiction in verse, essays, poems, theater, and literary reviews. She's a professor of creative writing at the University Brunel in London and vice president of the Royal Society of Literature. We're going to be talking this evening about her novel, Girl, Woman, Other, published recently by Companhia das Letras in Brazil, which is her 8th book, which won the Man Booker and other awards, international awards. And on Diasporas. Welcome, Bernardine.
Hello, hi, good to be here. Hello, everybody in Brazil. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but maybe next year or the year after.
Olha, eu espero que nós estejamos.
I truly hope that very soon we can count on your presence here with us in person, because one of the points that excited me about this conversation with you is how your novel also includes a number of common points with the Brazilian reality. although people talk a lot about how it is an extremely contemporary novel centered on the lives of Black people, especially Black women, but also trans persons, non-binaries, and also there are several questions and issues of multiple origins, of issues involving race, class, and belonging in dialogue with the Brazilian reality. So I hope and believe that our conversation will invite curious readers, people who are already interested in your books, to read this book as soon as possible. I would like to begin by asking you a little bit about how you reached the form of their novel, because in addition to your novel having this structure with multiple protagonists, characters, you write in a structure which, in a word, you don't use periods. You simply break the line and continue. When we look visually, it's like poetry, and oftentimes the rhythm and pace is very poetic. So I'd like to know from you, Bernardine, how you reached this such a different form of telling these stories.
Yeah, certainly. Just to say that it's really heartening to hear that you feel that the book has relevance in Brazil in terms of Black Brazilian experiences, because this is the first time I've heard this. And what's so interesting about this book is that it is being translated into many languages, and so it is reaching Black people in a lot of countries who wouldn't necessarily read it in English. And often they are saying to me that they relate to it. So this is a really wonderful thing. I love the fact, because when I wrote this book, I wasn't thinking of a global audience, but I love the fact that it will hopefully have some impact among Black Brazilian women in particular. That's really exciting to me. So the form of the novel I call a fusion fiction. And by that, I mean that it's an experimental novel. And in terms of form, I feel it's a radical novel in terms of content. And there aren't many full stops in the novel. And as you say, the language on the page almost looks like poetry, but it's not quite poetry. And I found it a very liberating form to write, because when you remove the full stops, there was a free-flowing experience when I was writing the book. And I feel that the book would have been very different if I had written traditional sentences and traditional paragraphs. It wouldn't have given me the freedom to do all the things I do with the novel in terms of the characters and how much you know about their lives and the way in which I convey the experiences of their lives. So it's an experimental form. It disrupts the orthodox punctuation and grammar. And in doing that, it kind of, in a sense, liberates the story. And then the fusion fiction is also the fact that each woman has her own section, her own chapter, but their stories are all fused together. And so that in a very basic way, this is how I see the form working.
Esse livro não é a primeira vez
This
que você...
book, it's not the first time that you do this kind of experimentation. Researching today to talk to you, I found Emperor Babe, which is fiction in verse because it's centered on a single character, the Emperor's Babe. It's not as fluid as this book. And also, I saw several reports by you talking about your interest in telling stories which normally are not told. So the life of Black women, the lives of people, queer persons, descendants of immigrants. In a word, do you believe that your innovations are they related to the fact that you want to tell these stories, different stories, and since you're telling a story that is not common in literature, is this reflected in the way that you tell the story, in the way that you write?
Yes, I think so. So I began by writing for theatre, and I used to run a theatre company called Theatre of Black Women in the 1980s, and we were creating theatre from a Black woman's perspective for the first time in the UK. Nobody else had created a Black women's theatre company, and part of the project for us was to find a form that fitted what we wanted to say, because we didn't feel that we were really connected to more traditional British theatre. And we didn't want to imprison, in a sense, our ideas and our stories and our dramas within any kind of British convention. And so we were very influenced by Ntozake Shange's choreo poem for colour girls who are considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, which was published in the late 70s. And it's a stage play, but it's also poetry, and it's very experimental. And I think my whole writing practice, in a sense, goes back to that book, and maybe some other earlier books, where writers were exploring form to engage with different kinds of stories. And so all of my books, so you mentioned The Emperor's Babe, it's a novel in verse. And that was my second book. And my third book was also a novel in verse. And my fourth book, Soul Tourist, was a novel with verse. So it was a novel where I had poetry sitting side by side with prose, and also prose poetry, and also scripts. And it was all in a single novel. And that was the best way in which I could tell that story. And my last novel, Mr. Loverman, it's a dual narrative between a 74-year-old gay Caribbean man who lives in London and his wife. And he's in the closet and she doesn't know he's gay, and they've been married together 50 years. So they both have their own sections in the novel, and I use that form that I use pretty much in Girl, Woman, Other in that novel. So it really is about going on a journey and finding a way to tell a story that hasn't been told before, as you said, in a way that it feels right. It feels right for the narrative. So that's what I've been doing ever since I started writing for theatre. Yeah, kind of exploring form and content, and always bringing in those stories that haven't been told, that we need to hear more of, that have been marginalized, and creating magic in terms of how I tell the story, in terms of the form.
Eu comecei falando da
I began by talking about the form because it really called my attention when I began to read your book, because I didn't want to stop. I couldn't stop. I identified with the characters, and I think it would be easy for us to talk about all of these characters because, in a word, they are they grab at you, they're contradictory and everything also, but it was clear to me that you found a way of making very clear the difference between the voices of these women. So it's not just to say that they are different, period. The pace, the tempo, and the way they speak, the internal monologue in each of them. So it really changes, although it's all fusion fiction. From one chapter to another, we note that the differences in age and class, schooling are all reflected in the voice of each of your characters. Tell us a little bit about the challenge of finding the voice for these characters.
Yes. You know, it wasn't so much of a challenge. That's the thing. People think, oh my God, it must be so hard. But actually, it wasn't really. I mean, there were other problems with writing the book in terms of that form, the form being very free-flowing to write. And then when it came to editing, it was really hard to edit, really, really hard, because I couldn't see what I'd done because I wasn't using traditional English grammar. But in terms of those characters, they all, I would say that nearly all of them emerged fully formed. And as you say, they're a diverse range of women. And it was really important to me that, that these 12 women and one character is non-binary, that these 12 characters should be really different and distinct from each other. Because in a sense, the whole project of the book was to show some of the multiplicity of who we are in the world, right? We're not the same, we're different. We're all different individuals in the same way that white people are all different individuals. So I wanted them all to be distinctly different from each other. And that meant that I would have women of every age, every generation. The youngest is 19, the oldest is 93. And then there's a spread of women in between, but every woman, we see them in their childhood as well. And I would start writing a character and I would have a vague idea of who they were. And then through the act of writing, they would start to emerge, which for me is one of the most exciting things about the creative process, that I don't have fully formed ideas in my head, but as soon as I start typing, it all comes together. Some of the characters were kind of loosely based on people that I've known. You know, I say a couple of them. One of the characters, Amma, is loosely based on my younger self. And then the others are all figments of my imagination. But I have been around Black women all my life. You know, I did grow up in a very white area of London, but I had 3 sisters. And I've, you know, had Black female friends all my adult life. And I have met and encountered and had friendships and all kinds of associations with Black women. And so when I'm writing this novel, they're all, you know, I've absorbed all these women over all these decades. And they, in a sense, they're coming out, right? So when people read the book and Black women say to me, I feel it's me, I feel seen, they say, it may not be that they think, oh yes, I'm Carol, or I'm Winsome, or I'm, I don't know, Morgan. It may not be that, but it's just that I, as a Black woman who has lived quite a long life, and have been around Black women for all my life, I have written a book about us. And so all those ways in which we are in the world, some of the ways in which we are in the world, are bubbling underneath the surface of the book. So when people say that they feel seen, I know what they're talking about, because this is a book that, you know, a white man could not have written this book, because it comes from all this experience of who we are in the world from inside, not looking at it from the outside, but from inside. So it was a joyful process creating all the different characters, and some of them emerged very very easily, because I would have a mother and her daughter would appear in her section, for example, Amma and Yaz, and then I would have a daughter, Shirley, and her mother would appear in her section. And so whenever these mothers and daughters appeared, I would also give them their own sections. So they came in a very, you know, a lot of them emerged in a very natural way, very easy way.
Essa questão das relações.
This issue of relations between women, it's very special in the book, because in addition to you dealing with the subjectivity of Black women and our contradictions and great subtlety, you also show numerous different mother-daughter relations that are completely different, all the way from mothers and daughters who are great friends, others aren't that close, and others drifted apart over the course of life, but afterwards they reconcile and reconnect. When you began to write the book, did you think that these family relations would be that important in building your novel, or was this just organic and it came out naturally?
Yeah, it was very organic. I had no intention. And I would say also that towards the end of the novel, it was then that I realized that I had all these mother-daughter relationships, because I was so stuck in the novel and I was writing it from the inside out in a way. And it was only towards the end that I thought, hang on, there are all these mother-daughters. And it just happened in a very natural way. And I think, but to me, it makes sense that that would be the case. Because with a novel like this, where you're going back to your characters' childhoods, because I go back and every character, you see them as a child to a greater or lesser extent. And then you see them on their journey to whatever age they are in the novel. Family are going to be part of that. Their guardians, their parents, whatever, are going to be part of their story. And so I think that's probably partly how that emerged. And then it feels totally right that there should be mother-daughter relationships, a really strong representation of mother-daughter relationships. So even though there are 4 mother-daughter relationships out of, that's a big percentage of the book, there are also many other mother-daughter relationships, actually, that are kind of like sub-stories and sub-characters. So actually, this is the kind of book where if you look at it, you could say, at a very simplistic level, some people say it's about race, right? But that's part of it, but it's about so much more than race. You mentioned class and sexuality. It's also about work. It's about many things. But actually, you could say it's a book about mothers and daughters, because mothers and daughters are carried throughout the whole of the book in lots of different ways, with the main characters and with some of the sort of secondary figures. And that is who we are in the world, isn't it? We're mothers and daughters. And that's not explored much in fiction. And because this is a book that is multi-generational as well as intergenerational, some of those mother-daughter relationships are very long-standing relationships. So, so for example, Shirley is 60 and her mother is 80. So in the novel, we see that relationship that has gone on for 60 years, right? And the other interesting thing is that I'm not a mother. I'm not a mother. It's my choice. And somebody who's a friend of mine, who's a writer, said to me, she said, I really learned a lot about motherhood, right? And she's a mother. And I was laughing because I'm like, I'm teaching you about motherhood. You're a mother and I'm not. Right? So that was very interesting. But I have been around, obviously, lots of mothers. And I've been around lots of children in my life. And as a writer, you just soak it all up. You soak it all up and then use your imagination to do something with it.
Você agora falou sobre essa questão
You
de
talked
não
about this issue of not being a mother, but writing about mothers. And you write about mothers with great sensitivity. Some of them want to be mothers. Some of them don't want to be mothers, but they do the best that they can to raise their children. There's several different things happening in these relations. But I'd like to take advantage of the opportunity at this point to ask you about the character, non-binary character, because oftentimes people enter into essentialism. And that's where I want to say it's obvious that we need increasingly to have authors, trans authors published with telling their own stories for us to be able to learn, for us cis people to learn. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how it was to write concerning this non-binary character, because you do this with great sensibility and great care in translating into Portuguese. The translator took huge care to adapt the language as Megan becomes Morgan and transitions, the language changes. And this was great editorial care, which I thought was extremely important because gender in Portuguese, it is extremely binary in Portuguese. So I know it must have been a great challenge for the translator, and she did a fabulous job. I'd like you to tell us about how you think that we can take on the responsibility to open up these spaces for these conversations in a sensitive way. How do you think that fiction can help in that sense?
Yes. Well, I'm asked about this a little bit, and I'm asked about cultural appropriation and the whole thing about who's allowed to tell whose story. And I think it's really complicated. But I think, as my personal opinion is that I feel that I have total freedom to write any kind of story, from any kind of perspective. And I think that's what it means to be an artist, right? To have complete freedom. But with freedom, we know comes responsibility, right? But at the same time, I feel that as a writer, so you said that you felt that I had approached the character of Morgan very sensitively. And I think that's true. That is what I wanted to do. But at the same time, I'm very bloody minded in that I was going to create the character as I wanted to create them, So yes, I was sensitive, but I didn't show it. And I have non-binary friends. I didn't show it to them and say, is this all right? Am I allowed to do this? Because I didn't want anybody to censor the way I wanted to tell the story. And I'm very lucky in a way, I think, because nobody has criticized me yet, right, about the presentation of Morgan in the novel. And that's a bit of a relief because I was worried that people might tell me I've got it wrong as such. But I think when you're creating fictional characters that, there is no right or wrong, really. There are some facts that you need to get right, especially when you're crossing and writing across cultures. But right and wrong are not the kind of binaries that I would necessarily use for when we do that, for when I write a trans character or a white writer creates a black protagonist. I think that the really interesting conversation is about how we do that. How do we tell, in a sense, each other's stories? But then it's not just about telling the stories, it's also about the reception and the publishing of the work and how that is curated and how that is received. And it's complicated because there's a writer called Catherine Stockett who wrote a book called The Help, and it was published in America about 10 years ago. And she had grown up in the 60s in a rich Southern family, and she had a maid in the family, a black African-American maid. And she decided to write a novel from the maid's perspective, right? So the maid who was working for her family, she wrote her story many years later and got a lot of criticism for it. And I was very critical of the book as well, because I just felt it was exploitative, right? But at the same time, she did have the right to write that book if she wanted. But the other thing about that was that the publishing industry, she's a very attractive, blonde, thin woman. And the publishing industry really promoted her. Look at this blonde woman writing about this black maid, isn't it wonderful, right? And that was very problematic. But essentially, I think the job of a writer is to inhabit characters who are not yourself. And it is to see multiple perspectives. I think ideally, not every writer does that, but it's to engage with our society, past, present, future, and to illuminate it in some way and to create drama from it. And I think the trans issue is one that people need to embrace as well. But you see that another complication might be if you have a load of cis writers writing trans stories and trans writers can't get published. So sometimes I think I oversimplify the issue because I say, yes, freedom, we need to have that creative freedom. But on the other hand, I also think, yeah, but there are so many complications around this issue. But I think literature is a wonderful vehicle for bridging differences, especially for fiction in particular, for providing insight into cultures and societies and psychologies, and for narrowing the gap between who we are and the people we think are not like us, because essentially, we all have a shared humanity. And if that's one thing, I think, hopefully people take away from Girl, Woman, Other, it is about a shared humanity. Yeah, so there we go.
Uma outra coisa que é
Another issue which is extremely impressive in your book is how you deal with several different moments in time and various different places, because we begin following Amma on a long walk in London, and as the book unfolds, suddenly we're in Barbados or Nigeria, and it's like, that's why I began this roundtable talking about how one relates to the Brazilian experience, because here we Brazilians, we also have our issues of where we came from, right? Before we became Brazilians, our origins, and also this issue of how oftentimes we see ourselves represented by a literature coming from Africa or from the Caribbean or some regions from the United States. So I was impressed the way you created this web of places and moments in time which dialogue with each other. Did you have to research this when you edited to make everything come together?
Yeah, that did take a little bit of research, but I have with all my books, nearly all my books, they travel, because part of my ancestry is Brazilian anyway. On my father's side, he was Nigerian, but that's why I have Evaristo as a surname. And my family is very multicultural, Irish and German and British and Brazilian and Nigerian. So that's in my DNA in a sense, because everybody in my family have been migrants going back into history. And so as a writer, I've loved travel ever since I've been able to travel as an adult, and I do travel a lot. And I find it very exciting to write about different countries. So in the same way that I find it exciting to write about people who are not me, nothing like me, I also find it exciting to write about the world and to recreate parts of the world. And I've done that with all my books. And the book you mentioned, The Emperor's Babe, is set in Roman London. And I've recreated Roman London, which was, in the book, it's 1,800 years ago. So that's going deep into history. So that's another kind of very deep travel. And with this book, it was just really important because the British Black experience is one of migration. And it does go back to the Romans 2,000 years ago. But, certainly since the 16th century, there's been a lot of recorded, the records are there. Very well recorded for the Black presence in this country. And it hasn't been a continuous presence in the sense like in America, where people's families have been there perhaps 400 years. In Britain, it's very broken. But if you look at the demographic of Black people in Britain today, then they will come from probably the 52, 53 countries in Africa. Somebody will have come from Africa and all those countries. And also all those nations within those countries, and otherwise known as tribes. My father's Yoruba, but Nigeria has, I don't know, loads of tribes, maybe 100 or something. And then they also come from the 30-odd countries of the Caribbean, and then from other countries as well. But those are the two main continents that Black people in Britain come from. First generation, second generation, third generation, whatever. And so writing about these characters, some of them had to be immigrants. And so, yes, there is a character who comes from Barbados and lives in London a long time and then goes back to Barbados. There is a woman who comes from Nigeria. There are also people in different parts of England, like there's somebody in the far north of England and Northumberland. And that, for Londoners, that's like another country, right? Because it's so different to the capital city. And I absolutely love doing the research to try and bring those places alive, even if I haven't visited them. So I haven't been to Barbados, but I was able to do the research on the internet and also check with a friend of mine. So that is where I do check, who is from Barbados, that everything was right. Because I think when you're writing about a place, as opposed to characters, then you do have to get some of the facts totally right. And for me, it's also about, I think it's interesting for the reader to have a book that has kind of multiple geographies, but also I love the experience of creating different places as if they were, next door. So creating a really immersive experience as a writer for the reader, so that the reader feels that they are in these different locations that I'm describing. And we do that as fiction writers through the senses: sound, smell, touch, and a lot of very specific detail. And one of the joys of writing for me is about describing people, but really describing place, so that the reader can be there and see it and feel it and touch it.
Bernardine, você comentou
Bernardine,
agora que
you
você
just commented that you have Brazilian origins, and we learned that you've already been in Brazil before. When were you in Brazil? Where did you visit and when?
Yeah.
And tell us that story.
Yes, so I came in, I think it was 92, that was the first time, and I came with my cousin. And my father's father had come over from Brazil, and he was part of the migration of freed slaves and their descendants at the end of the 19th century, who went back to, I don't know if this is common knowledge in Brazil, but they sailed back to West Africa and settled along the West African coast. And so my father grew up in what was called the Brazilian quarter of Lagos. And so I was fascinated by the idea of having heritage in Brazil. And so my cousin and I went to Brazil. I say came as if I'm in Brazil, went to Brazil, and we spent a month there. And we didn't realize how expensive it was. And so we didn't have much money. So we had to live really cheaply, and we didn't do everything that we wanted to do. But we went to Rio, which at that time was a little bit hostile to us, I would say, as two Black women. And we caught the buses up to Bahia, and then a bus to where you get the, it's the town from where you get the boat down the Amazon to Manaus. Belém. So we got a bus to Belém, and then went down the Amazon to Manaus, and then I think we got a plane or something back to Rio. And it was wonderful. The only problem was the language, not being able to communicate easily with most people. And then I didn't go for many years, and then I went to the FLUP festival in 2013. And yeah, that was my second trip, and this would have been my third.
Eu espero que em breve você
I hope that very soon you can visit Brazil in person again. This story of former slaves who returned to the coast of Africa. The first time that I heard of this, they don't teach this to us in schools. It was in a novel, a historical novel called Defect of Color by one of our great Brazilian novelists, Ana Maria Gonçalves. It's called Defeito de Cor. She tells the story of a slave who is able to find her manumission papers, and she saves up her money and goes back to Benin, where her family came from. And then she comes back to Brazil again to find her son.
Enfim, uma coisa que eu queria perguntar.
Something that I wanted to ask you now, going back to the question of sexuality, but also I wanted to talk about the novels and affective relations in your book, because we have several different characters in several different places. Some of them are lesbians, some of them in the range, some of them bisexual relations, but they don't even question their own orientation. There are characters who are not monogamous, and characters who are highly monogamous, I see a debate, contemporary debate, talking about having LGBT characters in novels or films, but that they always have an unhappy ending, or as if they were punished because they weren't straight. At some points, I think that your characters, your gay characters, have much better resolved relations than the straight characters. Was that a concern for you that the queer and lesbian characters have healthy relations and happy endings?
Yes. Well, let me see. So I think I know what you're talking about. The sort of the tragedy of being, queer, and that's something that I know a lot of gay people are really pissed off about. That there's a tragic ending to novels and so on. And I'm not somebody who would ever do that, really. So what I wanted was, my intention was to make sure that the novel was not offering a token gesture towards homosexuality. So I could have had one queer character in the novel, and people would have thought that that was okay. But no. I wanted to actually have homosexuality sown throughout the novel in one way or another. And so I think about a quarter of the women are on the queer spectrum in different ways, as you mentioned. And that was really interesting to write, because I knew that we're not very visible in British fiction as Black women, and we're definitely not visible when the sexuality is not a straight sexuality. Black lesbians or Black women on the queer spectrum are not, there is no evidence for it in British fiction, almost none. And so I really wanted to make the point that, Black women have all kinds of different sexualities, the same as anybody else. And so that was my consideration. And I wanted there to be positive relationships, but actually there is a really toxic relationship as well. And that's the relationship between Dominique and Nzinga, which is, Dominique Nzinga is, she exerts coercive control over Dominique, and it's an abusive relationship, and it's very difficult. And Dominique has to escape that relationship. And I was worried a little bit about that, because I thought, well, I'm creating these characters who are queer, and now I'm creating this really dysfunctional queer relationship. And is the queer community going to think, oh, look what you've done to us, But then I thought, it's true to life, people have all kinds of relationships, regardless of their sexuality. And there are all kinds of power dynamics at play in different relationships. And that applies to homosexual relationships. Homosexual relationships are not exempt from the toxicity of what can happen in straight relationships. I used to be queer, right, in my 20s, and I haven't been for 30 years. So I am talking from a slightly informed position, shall we say, because I was very much part of the queer community in my 20s. And so that slightly disturbed me. And I think as a writer anyway, always in the back of my mind, because I'm a political person, I'm inside my characters, I'm writing their stories, but I'm pulling at many strands in order to create these characters. And in the back of my mind, I'm always weighing up what am I saying? What am I saying about these characters? How can this be interpreted? How can this be misconstrued? And I think it's a constant thing, and it's happening so much, I'm not even aware of it, in a sense. So positive and happy, that would be too simplistic for all those characters, but there is an element of it, definitely. And also, because it's a novel about Black British women, mainly, I wanted each woman to, in a sense, be triumphant. Not in a cliched way where they're all powerful. Oh yeah, they're all powerful Black women, they can handle anything. But just in their daily lives, even though some of them have do go through traumas, even though some of them struggle more than others. I wanted them to somehow have some level of victory in their lives and not to be victims, because I'm not interested in writing us as victims. That doesn't serve a purpose at all. So these are some of the thoughts that are going on in my mind when I'm writing.
Bom, o nosso público começou a
So
mandar.
our audience has been sending questions in, so I'm going to begin to read some questions from the audience here, the wide audience in Brazil. Carolina Mello would like to know what the Black writers, which Black writers influenced you, and whether you have some relationship with the work of Zorani Hurston, if I got the name, or authors, Brazilian Black authors, Black women authors.
Now I'm really going to be shown up here. I'm really going to be shown up because I read very little Brazilian fiction, and I'm sorry, but I will make up for it. African American women writers were my big inspiration years ago in my 20s. Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, most definitely Audre Lorde, a writer called Gloria Naylor, a writer called Michelle Cliff. I read some really important Black women's anthologies in the early 1980s that had come out of America, where there were just so many different Black women writing all kinds of forms, all kinds of perspectives and stories and so on. And those were the writers who really inspired me as a writer, not white writers and not white British writers, because again, in the same way that I felt distanced from British theatre, I also felt distanced from, is that Zadie Smith there? How did she appear? That's funny. In the same way that I felt distanced from British theatre, I also felt distanced from white British writers, because I was not included in those stories, and I was, I did not identify with them. And then those African American writers, I realised that there was this burden of influence because they were so extraordinary, so brilliant, that I felt that I couldn't write like them, and so I eventually developed my own voice. Right, Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is one of my favourite all-time books. It is a truly amazing book, and Zora Neale Hurston was ahead of her time. She was a trailblazer. I think she died in about 1960, and I think she died, at the end of her life in a bad way. But she was, a formidable woman, writer, anthropologist, traveller, character. And I didn't discover her in my early 20s. I probably discovered her a bit later. But yes, for sure, and Their Eyes Were Watching God is a classic. It's a classic of any kind of literature.
O romance da Zora Neale.
The novel of Zora Neale Hurston, Your Eyes on God, was published here in Brazil. Unfortunately, it's out of print. I hope that this conversation will encourage and motivate the publishing houses to republish her work. But you were saying, Bernardine, about reading, the fact that you'd read little Brazilian fiction. We found difficulty in translating our works, literary works, into English. There are many hurdles because we have to take our initiative to translate them, to offer them to the publishing market in English. There are a number of issues and hurdles. So it's not just your own responsibility, it's an issue of access to the Brazilian fiction. And just to give you an idea, you mentioned Audre Lorde. She began to be published in Brazil last year, just last year. So we still have a long delay in receiving some of the feminists, because for a long time, people didn't realize that the Brazilian public was interested in reading lesbian feminists, Black feminists, and I perhaps am one of the translators from Audre Lorde's work in Brazil, per chance. And reading your book and reading your interviews where you mention Lorde, I remembered a quote by her when she says that she refuses to use facile definitions of blackness. And I think that your novel, it is a radical example of this idea, her idea. So I'm stating this here to raise another question from the audience. Barbara Porto, who says, each character is complex. All of them, in one way or another, are survivors and have some wisdom, but this does not make any of them a model for behavior. And was this intentional?
Yes, definitely, because they're only human, right? They're only human. We're all only human, so we are all complex, and we all have flaws, and we all have patterns of behavior that are, not always showing us in our best interest. And I think one of the things I wanted to do was to show the humanity of the women, the characters. And one of the ways to do that is to show their flaws and their weaknesses. And I would say that the novel does have, it's quite humorous in places. And some of that humor comes from the way in which the characters see themselves. So often they do have quite a noble image of themselves in the world, but other people around them will see them differently. And in fact, the complexity of the characters is partly because you'll get, Amma, and we'll get Amma's view of herself, and she's quite, she's quite. Well, I can't think of what the word is, but she presents herself as a politically correct kind of, good person. And then you'll get her daughter's view on Amma. And that's funny because her daughter is completely undermining her mother. And then you'll get Dominique's view on Amma. You'll get Shirley's view on Amma. You will get, Megan, when Megan goes to the theatre show, their view on Amma. And who else? You'll get so many different responses to almost every character. And so at the end of it, you do see a fully formed person, but you don't see a perfect person. And nor should you. And I think it's their imperfection that makes them very real for the reader, because we are imperfect. And even when they don't think they're imperfect, we'll know from the other people around them that they are. But the humor is quite gentle. And I think there is a lot of humor in how people see themselves and present themselves, and how other people see them, and the disjunction between the two.
And this effect is not just with Amma, it happens with Shirley as well. She is a teacher. The girl, she's a friend of Amma. And this also, up to the end of the novel, and suddenly we have several different views which are extremely different of their own self-image. I think Shirley has a much greater contrast than Amma in that sense. We have here another question, and we are going to begin to wrap up. João Miguel would like to know if you still continue to do theater, and for you to talk a little bit about your experience with theater.
Yes, no, I don't do theatre anymore. I did write a monologue for a theatre company called the Old Vic Theatre this summer. But that was very unusual because I left theatre behind in the 1980s, and I stopped writing and acting because I was originally an actor and a writer, and I stopped both of that, those things, and eventually decided that what I loved doing was writing. But I do love theatre. I go to theatre a lot, and I would like to write more theatre, but I'm always so busy writing books that I don't seem to find my way around it. So.
Bom, nós estamos chegando.
Okay, we're reaching the end of our conversation. I want to thank the audience who participated and sent in the questions. I want to thank Flip for having invited me to have this marvelous conversation. And Bernardine, I want to thank you for participating. I want to thank you for having written this novel, which I'm certain will influence and echo for many Black women. Non-Black people will enjoy it because there are interesting issues as well. But I think that for us, it has points which are fascinating for us to reflect on, precisely this complex construction of the characters and girl, woman, other, and this issue of the story of how we deal with generational issues. And I personally, as a poet, I'm going to be thinking about the form and the way that you produced this narrative, this incredible narrative. So thank you indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been a really lovely interview. And thank you to everybody who's attending. I want to say hello to Liz Calder, if she's watching, and also to my friend Isabella Norin. I never know how to say your surname, Isabella Noronho. I know you're out there somewhere. And I hope to be in Brazil, you know, in the next few years.
Aê!